All right, let's get to PEACE-3 before we wrap up. Our friend and colleague Silke Gillison presented these data at ESMO in a presidential session. This was enza plus minus radium-223 in a metastatic CRPC setting. We can see again in the era that this accrued that this was 30% prior treatment with docetaxel, only a small percentage, 2 or 3% of prior ABI, again, just given sort of the timeline of this trial. So not necessarily the modern CRPC patients we see, at least in the US, but probably globally around the world to some extent. And I think, I don't know, maybe somewhat surprisingly, you all can tell me, both an RPFS and an OS advantage with identical hazard ratios, which we don't see too much, right, where that preservation of RPFS efficacy is carried through to OS. And as we said, I mean, radium's sort of just, I don't know why, it has like a bad personality. I don't know, it just hasn't like, I remember when the first the Al-Simca trial came out, it was like surprisingly positive, right? But then it didn't get much use. So who wants to sort of jump in terms of, I mean, this is a new standard of care, right? Overall survival benefit in CRPC. Number one, do you agree with that? And number two, how do you think it's going to be used in clinical practice given sort of some of the parameters of the trial? Tanya? I
think we need to still be doing NGS. We need to be testing our patients to see, because this is the same population as the PARP inhibitor and AR pathway inhibitor combinations, theoretically.
We were trying to avoid PARP inhibitors this meeting.
Yes. So, sorry, I didn't get the memo. I'm just saying, like, yes, this is a new option, but it's not the only one. Sure. And it's important that we remember to use genomic markers as
how would you use it? Assume regulatory approval, your current practice of CRPC, whatever patient mix you see.
Well, most of my patients get upfront doublet, and that wasn't really represented.
And you would not use it in a patient who got upfront doublet?
I would never say never. I think I'd have to inform the patient that we don't know what these results would look like in the context of having progressed on abiraterone, but if they have a heavy burden of bone disease, and symptoms, I think it's very nice to be able to give these together, and I don't think we're going to get too much pushback in that population, but I could be wrong.
From payers.
We'll see what payers.
And you were shaking your head.
I don't remember at what comment, but
yes or no?
Yeah. Was it an agreement? No, I mean, I think the drug shows the trial shows the synergy of two active drugs, so it's not surprising to me at all. I think the first-line CRPC population is, at least in my practice, something that I don't see very often because all of my patients are getting doublet therapies. But for those who have not, I think it's something that should be given.
Gary, how much radium are we giving?
I don't recall the last radium dose that we actually gave.
I've definitely given it, but it's been a while. Yeah. It's been a minute. So
it has been a while.
It's not used.
Because the combo will lower PSA in a way that radium alone does not. I wonder if that will help with the adoption of the combination. Because I think some of the hesitancy on radium was understanding on an individual level if somebody was actually benefiting or not. So maybe in combo that will.
Also, now that we have the lutetium and we're more used to sharing our patients and this multidisciplinary management with nuclear medicine or radiation oncology, I think back then, it was easier to keep the patient in your practice and give chemotherapy than have to refer them out. And not every hospital gives radium-223, just like not every hospital will give lutetium-177, but we're getting more used to that.
Yeah, the operational pathways are more smooth now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Michael?
Just 3 quick points. First, DORA, which is DOSI versus DOSI and radium, is ongoing, and I hope that these data put a lift under the sails.
CRPC, metastatic
CRPC, yep. So that trial is open and accruing across the U.S., Spain, and Brazil.
And presumably a lot of those patients will have had prior ARPI. Yeah. Almost all.
They have to be DOSI candidates. So, second, I think you made a really astute observation about how the hazard ratio is preserved from RPFS to OS.
I appreciate you saying that.
And of course, most RPFS events are bony. Mm-hmm. And this is bone-directed therapy. And indeed, the lethality of the alpha emission is primarily to the osteoblast and osteoclast rather than the tumor cell. And that speaks that radium's really different than most other therapies. You don't expect to see a PSA decline. The the primary anticipator of longevity with radium is a change in bone markers, bone turnover markers, not PSA. So I'm not surprised that rPFS, from a hazard ratio standpoint, is essentially the OS advantage, and also shows sort of not the usual absolute, usually we're used to seeing absolute really huge differences in rPFS between the two arms as opposed to OS. So, bone scans sort of lose their value to some degree with radium because you are targeting the very thing that is making the bone scan positive, which is osteoblastic deposition of hydroxyapatite. And then thirdly, yes, I do think that this is a new standard of care. It doesn't speak to a current patient population, but it's really important, I think, that not to forget that old drugs that aren't the shiniest new penny on the ground and that have these data, much like Charted did for chemotherapy, these are actually really valuable tools. And we should definitely, we have been underusing radium and shouldn't forget that, this is a positive trial for a patient population, not so common anymore, but when you see these patients, think about it.
How will you use it in practice?
I, like everyone else on the panel, generally, this is a moot question. I don't see that many patients who have not received it. But to answer your question about, and Tanya's as well, who might I use it? So let's say I had a non-HRD patient and non-Lynch patient, and he had a bone scan full of metastases, and he was not a chemotherapy candidate absolutely for some other reason.
Okay.
I would use radium and enza in that patient.
And he's never had Abby.
And and I'm presuming he no, I'm really talking about in the second line setting.
Okay.
Like when would I, because Tanya said I would never say never, but that's the circumstance where I would
Even
say.
if they had this patient had prior Abby.
Yeah.
Because they're,
Yeah.
I got you.
Yeah.
Petros, quick question?
Guys, this is wonderful. The question I have is more generic about drug development at this modern era in prostate cancer. Because of all these new agents and we're miles ahead compared to 10 years ago, do we really need overall survival these days? Can we get by with rPFS and quality of life endpoints? Can we say, because many people in the industry are here, can we redefine the metric of success? Question mark. Thank you.
Short question, long discussion. Petros.
This is a short question.
I mean, I think that's a big drug development question. I think it kind of depends on the context, right? I mean, in some settings, rPFS with quality of life endpoints is super valuable, right? We always want OS, of course, right? But is it mandatory? I don't think so. Michael, we can
You
kind
have
of
to
go
push
down.
me really hard to ever do a crossover study again. I think we've paid for that now. Twice, and with PSMA addition, we'll probably pay for it again. I think it was a mistake to try to offer that. In the end, we probably will hurt more patients if it jeopardizes approval of active therapy than have helped the patients on the study to offer them the opportunity to get the drug, especially since it's approved for later use.
That's a big discussion.
No, the Titan study did have crossover and showed OS advantage, but you're saying that we should not be doing those?
Well, I think that's such a good segue to the questions.
I
There's a
think my
question that we
question
have.
may have gotten lost in the slide shuffle.
You're
Let me
right.
see.
Why? And I was really
Yeah, it did.
careful to separate myself from saying that it was the crossover that was responsible. I don't know that. It could be that its lutetium isn't potent enough. It's possible that the alphas will need to have that extra potency to sort of get over the hump. And it could be, like I sort of really casually said, that only 13 patients screen failed from vision, and 8% screen failed from PSMA4. Maybe our criteria are too liberal. Maybe we're not enriching enough. Maybe we should raise the bar in terms of positivity, take out the visceral metastases that have the least amount of benefit, and have trials that have greater enrichment for success if we are going to focus on OS.
Which means more selection bias.
Oh, of course, yeah, and less real world, and and perhaps lending credence to the Australian approach, which was double scanning And SUV
Yeah.
max of at least 20, for any single lesion, et cetera. If
But maybe that's why the treatment that shall not be named had an OS benefit despite crossover, because the biomarker was better, right?
Absolutely.
BRCA2 is such a good biomarker.
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Just one more question, Mike. Because all these lutetium moving earlier and earlier, and we are part of PSMA edition, we put the highest number of patients in the country. We are seeing neuroendocrine transformation early on with the lutetium combination. So I think while the enthusiasm is really great to move these even earlier on, we need to temper it before we know long-term safety data of these drugs.
And I actually think the P10RB P53 group should be considered its own disease entity. I really do. We should be studying those patients for what's the best for them for early intervention of therapy as its own pseudo-orphan disease, because they are
Different
special.
biology.
Yeah.
Yeah.